A Huguenot is a reformed member of a French Protestant denomination with origins in the 16th and 17th centuries. Historically, Huguenots were French Protestants inspired by the writings of John Calvin in the 1530s, who became known by that originally derisive designation by the end of the 16th century. The majority of Huguenots endorsed the Reformed tradition of Protestantism. Hans J. Hildebrand in his Encyclopedia of Protestantism, 4 volume set claims the Huguenot community reached as much as 10% of the French population on the eve of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, declining to 7 to 8% by the end of the 16th century, and further after heavy persecution began once again with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV of France. Huguenot numbers peaked near an estimated 2 million by 1562, concentrated mainly in the southern and central parts of France. About 1/8 the number of French Roman Catholics. As Huguenots gained influence and more openly displayed the faith, Catholic hostility grew. In spite of increasingly liberal political concessions and edicts of toleration from the French crown, a series of religious conflicts followed, known as the Wars of Religion, fought intermittently from 1562 to 1598. The wars finally ended with the granting of the Edict of Nantes, signed probably on the 30th of April 1598, which granted the Huguenots substantial religious, political, and military autonomy. Renewed religious warfare in the 1620s caused the political and military privileges of the Huguenots to be abolished following the defeat. They retained the religious provisions of the Edict of Nantes until the rule of Louis XIV, who progressively increased persecution of them until he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which abolished all legal recognition of Protestantism in France, and forced the Huguenots to convert. While nearly 3/4 eventually were killed or submitted, roughly 500,000 Huguenots had fled France by the early 18th century. The bulk of Huguenot émigrés relocated to Protestant European nations such as England, Wales, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, the Dutch Republic, the Electorate of Brandenburg and Electorate of the Palatinate in the Holy Roman Empire, the Duchy of Prussia, the Channel Islands, and Ireland. They also spread beyond Europe to the Dutch Cape Colony in South Africa, the Dutch East Indies, the Caribbean, New Netherlands, several of the English colonies in North America, and Quebec, where they were generally accepted and allowed to worship freely. Persecution of Protestants diminished in France after the death of Louis XIV in 1715, and officially ended with the Edict of Versailles, commonly called the Edict of Tolerance, signed by Louis XVI in 1787. 2 years later, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, Protestants gained equal rights as citizens. Today, most Huguenots have been assimilated into various societies and cultures, but remnant communities in Alsace and the Cévennes in France and a diaspora of Huguenots in England and French Australians still retain their Huguenot religious tradition. Etymology, a term used originally in derision, Huguenot has unclear origins. Various hypotheses have been promoted. The nickname may have been a combined reference to the Swiss politician Besançon and the religiously conflicted nature of Swiss republicanism in his time, using a clever derogatory pun on the name Hugues by way of the Dutch word Huisgenoten, referring to the connotations of a somewhat related word in German Eidgenos. Geneva was John Calvin's adopted home and the center of the Calvinist movement. In Geneva, Hugues, though Catholic, was a leader of the Confederate Party, so called because it favored independence from the Duke of Savoy through an alliance between the city-state of Geneva and the Swiss Confederation. The label Huguenot was purportedly first applied in France to those conspirators involved in the Amboise plot of 1560, a foiled attempt to wrest power in France from the influential House of Guise. The move would have had the side effect of fostering relations with the Swiss. Thus, Hugues plus Huguenots by way of Huguenot supposedly became Huguenot, a nickname associating the Protestant cause with politics unpopular in France. A version of this complex hypothesis is promoted by O.I.A. Roche, who writes in his book, The Days of the Upright, A History of the Huguenots, that Huguenot is a combination of a Dutch and a German word. In the Dutch-speaking north of France, Bible students who gathered in each other's houses to study secretly were called Huguenots, while on the Swiss and German borders they were termed Denomination, or oath fellows, that is, persons bound to each other by an oath. Gallicized into Huguenot, often used deprecatingly, the word became, during 2.5 centuries of terror and triumph, a badge of enduring honor and courage. Quote, some disagree with such double or triple non-French linguistic origins, arguing that for the word to have spread into common use in France, it must have originated in the French language. The Hugues hypothesis argues that the name was derived by association with Hugues Capet, King of France, who reigned long before the Reformation. He was regarded by the Gallicans and Protestants as a nobleman who respected people's dignity and lives. Janet Gray and other supporters of the hypothesis suggest that the name Huguenot would be roughly equivalent to Little Hugos, or those who want Hugo. In this last connection, the name could suggest the derogatory inference of superstitious worship. Popular fancy held that Huguin, the gate of King Hugo, was haunted by the ghost of Loire Hugo and other spirits, who instead of being in purgatory came back to harm the living at night. It was in this place in Tours that the prétendus réformés habitually gathered at night, both for political purposes, and for prayer and singing psalms. Such explanations have been traced to the contemporary Réguier de la Planche, who in de l'Aristat de France offered the following account as to the origin of the name, as cited by the Cape Monthly. The origin of the name is curious. It is not from the German Ida Genossen as has been supposed. Réguier de la Planche accounts for it as follows. The name Huguenon was given to those of the religion during the affair of Amboise, and they were to retell it ever since. I'll say a word about it to settle the doubts of those who have strayed in seeking its origin. The superstition of our ancestors, to within 20 or 30 years thereabouts, was such that in almost all the towns in the kingdom they had a notion that certain spirits underwent the purgatory in this world after death, and that they went about the town at night, striking and outraging many people whom they found in the streets. But the light of the gospel has made them vanish, and teaches us that these spirits were street strollers and ruffians. In Paris the spirit was called Le Moimbouré, at Orleans, Le Mulet Odette, at Blois, Le Loup Garin, at Tours, Le Roy Huguet, and so on in other places. Now, it happens that those whom they called Lutherans were at the time so narrowly watched during the day that they were forced to wait till night to assemble, for the purpose of praying God, for preaching and receiving the Holy Sacrament, so that, although they did not frighten or hurt anybody, the priests, through mockery, made them the successors of those spirits which roamed the night, and thus that name being quite common in the mouth of the populace, to designate the evangelical Huguenots in the country of Touraine and Amboise, it became in vogue after that enterprise. Quote, some have suggested the name was derived, with similar intended scorn, from les canons de Hus, while this and the many other theories offer their own measure of plausibility, attesting at least to the wit of later partisans and historians. No one of the several theories advanced has afforded satisfaction. History. Origins. The availability of the Bible in vernacular languages was important to the spread of the Protestant movement and development of the Reformed Church in France. The country had a long history of struggles with the papacy by the time the Protestant Reformation finally arrived. Around 1294, a French version of the Scriptures was prepared by the Roman Catholic priest Guy des Moulins. A two-volume illustrated folio paraphrase version based on his manuscript by Jean d'Arc was printed in Paris in 1487. The first known translation of the Bible into one of France's regional languages, Arpitina Franco-Provençal, had been prepared by the 12th century pre-reformer Peter Waldo. The Waldensians became more militant, creating fortified areas, as in Cabriès, perhaps attacking an abbey. They were suppressed by Francis I in 1545 in the Massacre of Merindel. Other predecessors of the Reformed Church included the pro-reform and Gallican Roman Catholics, such as Jacques Lefebvre. The Gallicans briefly achieved independence for the French Church, on the principle that the religion of France could not be controlled by the Bishop of Rome, a foreign power. During the Protestant Reformation, Lefebvre, a professor at the University of Paris, published his French translation of the New Testament in 1523, followed by the whole Bible in the French language in 1530. William Farel was a student of Lefebvre who went on to become a leader of the Swiss Reformation, establishing a Protestant government in Geneva. Jean Coven, another student at the University of Paris, also converted to Protestantism. Long after the sect was suppressed by Francis I, the remaining French Waldensians, then mostly in the Luberon region, sought to join William Farel, Calvin and the Reformation, and Olivetan published a French Bible for them. The French Confession of 1559 shows a decidedly Calvinistic influence. Sometime between 1550 and 1580, members of the Reformed Church in France came to be commonly known as Huguenots. Although usually Huguenots are lumped into one group, there were actually two types of Huguenots that emerged. Since the Huguenots had political and religious goals, it was commonplace to refer to the Calvinists as Huguenots of religion, and those who opposed the monarchy as Huguenots of the state, who were mostly nobles. The Huguenots of religion were influenced by John Calvin's works and established Calvinist synods. They were determined to end religious oppression. The Huguenots of the state opposed the monopoly of power the Guise family had and wanted to attack the authority of the crown. This group of Huguenots from southern France had frequent issues with the strict Calvinist tenets that are outlined in many of John Calvin's letters to the synods of the Languedoc. Criticisms of the Catholic Church. Like other religious reformers of the time, they felt that the Catholic Church needed radical cleansing of its impurities, and that the Pope represented a worldly kingdom, which sat in mocking tyranny over the things of God, and was ultimately doomed. Rhetoric like this became fiercer as events unfolded, and eventually stirred up a reaction in the Catholic establishment. Fanatically opposed to the Catholic Church, the Huguenots attacked priests, monks, nuns, monasticism, images, and church buildings. Most of the cities in which the Huguenots gained a hold saw iconoclast riots in which altars and images in churches, and sometimes the buildings themselves were torn down. Ancient relics and texts were destroyed, the bodies of saints exhumed and burned. The cities of Bourges, Montauban and Orleans saw substantial activity in this regard. The Huguenots transformed themselves into a definitive political movement thereafter. Protestant preachers rallied a considerable army and a formidable cavalry, which came under the leadership of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Henry of Navarre and the House of Bourbon allied themselves to the Huguenots, adding wealth and holdings to the Protestant strength, which at its height grew to 60 fortified cities, and posed a serious threat to the Catholic crown in Paris over the next 3 decades. The Catholic Church in France and many of its members opposed the Huguenots. Some Huguenot preachers and congregants were attacked as they attempted to meet for worship. The height of this persecution was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when 5,000 to 30,000 were killed, although there were also underlying political reasons for this as well. Some of the Huguenots were nobles trying to establish separate centers of power in southern France. Retaliating against the French Catholics, the Huguenots had their own militia. Reform and growth. Huguenots faced persecution from the outset of the Reformation, but Francis I initially protected the dissidents from parliamentary measures seeking to exterminate them. After the 1534 affair of the placards, he distanced himself from Huguenots and the protection. Huguenot numbers grew rapidly between 1555 and 1561, chiefly amongst nobles and city dwellers. During this time, their opponents first dubbed the Protestants Huguenots, but they called themselves Reformers, or Reformed. They organized the First National Synod in 1558 in Paris. By 1562, the estimated number of Huguenots peaked at approximately 2 million, concentrated mainly in the southern and central parts of France, compared to approximately 16 million Catholics during the same period. Persecution diminished the number of Huguenots who remained in France, as many fled to Switzerland, the Netherlands, Italy, and England. Wars of religion. As the Huguenots gained influence and displayed the faith more openly, Roman Catholic hostility to them grew, even though the French crown offered increasingly liberal political concessions and edicts of toleration. Following the accidental death of Henry II in 1559, his son succeeded as King Francis II along with his wife, the Queen Consort, also known as Mary, Queen of Scots. During the 18 months of the reign of Francis II, Mary encouraged a policy of rounding up French Huguenots on charges of heresy, in front of Catholic judges, and employing torture and burning as punishments for dissenters. Mary returned to Scotland a widow in the summer of 1561. In 1561, the Edict of Orleans declared an end to the persecution, and the Edict of Saint-Germain of January 1562 formally recognized the Huguenots for the first time. However, these measures disguised the growing tensions between Protestants and Catholics. Civil wars. These tensions spurred 8 civil wars, interrupted by periods of relative calm between 1562 and 1598. With each break in peace, the Huguenots' trust in the Catholic throne diminished, and the violence became more severe and Protestant demands became grander, until a lasting cessation of open hostility finally occurred in 1598. The wars gradually took on a dynastic character, developing into an extended feud between the houses of Bourbon and Guise, both of which, in addition to holding rival religious views, staked a claim to the French throne. The crown, occupied by the House of Valois, generally supported the Catholic side, but on occasion switched over to the Protestant cause when politically expedient. The French Wars of Religion began with the Massacre of Vassy on the 1st of March 1562, when dozens of Huguenots were killed, and about 200 were wounded. It was in this year that some Huguenots destroyed the tomb and remains of St. Irenaeus, an early church father and bishop who was a disciple of Polycarp. The Huguenots became organized as a definitive political movement thereafter. Protestant preachers rallied a considerable army and a formidable cavalry, which came under the leadership of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Henry of Navarre and the House of Bourbon allied with the Huguenots, adding wealth and holdings to the Protestant strength. At its height, they controlled 60 fortified cities and posed a serious threat to the Catholic crown in Paris over the next 3 decades. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of the 24th of August to 3rd of October 1572. Catholics killed thousands of Huguenots in Paris. Similar massacres took place in other towns in the weeks following. The main provincial towns and cities experiencing the massacre were Aix, Bordeaux, Bourges, Lyons, Meaux, Orleans, Rouen, Toulouse, and Troyes. Nearly 3,000 Protestants were slaughtered in Toulouse alone. The exact number of fatalities throughout the country is not known. On 23-24 August, between about 2,000 and 3,000 Protestants were killed in Paris and between 3,000 and 7,000 more in the French provinces. By the 17th of September, almost 25,000 Protestants had been massacred in Paris alone. Beyond Paris, the killings continued until the 3rd of October. An amnesty granted in 1573 pardoned the perpetrators. Edict of Nantes. The pattern of warfare, followed by brief periods of peace, continued for nearly another quarter-century. The warfare was definitively quelled in 1598, when Henry of Navarre, having succeeded to the French throne as Henry IV, and having recanted Protestantism in favor of Roman Catholicism, issued the Edict of Nantes. The edict reaffirmed Catholicism as the state religion of France, but granted the Protestants equality with Catholics under the throne and a degree of religious and political freedom within the domains. The edict simultaneously protected Catholic interests by discouraging the founding of new Protestant churches in Catholic-controlled regions. With the proclamation of the Edict of Nantes, and the subsequent protection of Huguenot rights, pressures to leave France abated. However, enforcement of the edict grew increasingly irregular over time, making life so intolerable that many fled the country. The Huguenot population of France dropped to 856,000 by the mid-1660s, of which a plurality lived in rural areas. The greatest concentrations of Huguenots at this time resided in the regions of Guyenne, Saint-Ouen, Angoumois and Poitou. Montpellier was among the most important of the 66 villes de sûreté that the Edict of 1598 granted to the Huguenots. The city's political institutions and the university were all handed over to the Huguenots. Tension with Paris led to a siege by the royal army in 1622. Peace terms called for the dismantling of the city's fortifications. A royal citadel was built and the university and consulate were taken over by the Catholic party. Even before the Edict of Aix, Protestant rule was dead and the Ville de Sûreté was no more. By 1620 the Huguenots were on the defensive, and the government increasingly applied pressure. A series of 3 small civil wars known as the Huguenot rebellions broke out, mainly in southwestern France, between 1621 and 1629. Revolted against royal authority. The uprising occurred a decade following the death of Henry IV, a Huguenot before converting to Catholicism, who had protected Protestants through the Edict of Nantes. His successor Louis XIII, under the regency of his Italian Catholic mother Marie de' Medici, became more intolerant of Protestantism. The Huguenots respond by establishing independent political and military structures, establishing diplomatic contacts with foreign powers, and openly revolting against central power. The rebellions were implacably suppressed by the French crown. Edict of Fontainebleau. Louis XIV gained the throne in 1643 and acted increasingly aggressively to force the Huguenots to convert. At first he sent missionaries backed by a fund to financially reward converts to Catholicism. Then he imposed penalties, closed Huguenot schools and excluded them from favored professions. Escalating, he instituted dragonnades, which included the occupation and looting of Huguenot homes by military troops, in an effort to forcibly convert them. In 1685, he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the Edict of Nantes and declaring Protestantism illegal. The revocation forbade Protestant services, a required education of children as Catholics, and prohibited emigration. It proved disastrous to the Huguenots and costly for France. It precipitated civil bloodshed, ruined commerce, and resulted in the illegal flight from the country of hundreds of thousands of Protestants, many of whom became intellectuals, doctors and business leaders in Britain as well as Holland, Prussia, and South Africa. 4,000 emigrated to the North American colonies, where they settled in New York and Virginia. Especially, the English welcomed the French refugees, providing money from both government and private agencies to aid the relocation. Those Huguenots who stayed in France became Catholics and were called new converts. After this, Huguenots fled to surrounding Protestant countries: England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, and Prussia, whose Calvinist Great Elector Frederick William welcomed them to help rebuild his war-ravaged and underpopulated country. Following this exodus, Huguenots remained in large numbers in only one region of France, the rugged Cévennes region in the south. In the early 18th century, a regional group known as the Camisards, who were Huguenots, rioted against the Catholic Church in the region, burning churches and killing clergy. It took French troops years to hunt down and destroy all the bands of Camisards between 1702 and 1709. End of persecution. By the 1760s, Protestants comprised about 700,000 people, or 2% of the population. It was no longer a favorite religion of the elite. Most Protestants were peasants. It was still illegal, and, although the law was seldom enforced, it could be a threat or a nuisance to Protestants. Calvinists lived primarily in the Midi. About 200,000 Lutherans lived in Alsace, where the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia still protected them. Persecution of Protestants diminished in France after 1724, finally ending with the Edict of Versailles, commonly called the Edict of Tolerance, signed by Louis XVI in 1787. 2 years later, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, Protestants gained equal rights as citizens. The government encouraged descendants of exiles to return, offering them French citizenship in of the 15th of December 1790 law. All persons born in a foreign country and descending in any degree of a French man or woman expatriated for religious reason are declared French nationals and will benefit from rights attached to that quality if they come back to France, establish their domicile there and take the civic oath. Quote, "This is the first law offering the right of return." Article 4 of the 26th of June 1889 nationality law stated, descendants of families proscribed by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes will continue to benefit from the benefit of the 15th of December 1790 law, but on the condition that a nominal decree should be issued for every petitioner. That decree will only produce its effects for the future. Foreign descendants of Huguenots lost the automatic right to French citizenship in 1945. It states in Article 3, this application does not, however, affect the validity of past acts by the person or rights acquired by third parties on the basis of previous laws. Modern times. In the 1920s and 1930s, members of the extreme right Action Française movement expressed strong animus against Huguenots and other Protestants in general, as well as against Jews and Freemasons. They were regarded as groups supporting the French Republic, which Action Française sought to overthrow. In World War II, Huguenots led by André Trichet in the village of La Chambon-sur-Lignon in Cevennes helped save many Jews. They hid them in secret places or helped them get out of Vichy France. André Trichet preached against discrimination as the Nazis were gaining power in neighboring Germany and urged his Protestant Huguenot congregation to hide Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. Approximately 1 million Protestants in modern France represent some 2% of its population. Most are concentrated in Alsace in northeast France and the Cevennes mountain region in the south, who still regard themselves as Huguenots to this day. A diaspora of French Australians still considers itself Huguenot, even after centuries of exile. Long integrated into Australian society, it is encouraged by the Huguenot Society of Australia to embrace and conserve its cultural heritage, aided by the Society's genealogical research services.